Welcome to the Friendly Atheist podcast. This is Jessica. I am recording from LA with special guest Jesse Thorn.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Jesse, would you like to describe who you are to listeners who may not know?
Oh, man. I have the problem with describing who I am is I have so many jobs that none of which mean anything to anyone. I own the podcasting company Maximum Fun, which makes and distributes several dozen podcasts at this point, including My Brother and Me, and Judge John Hodgman. And I also host a show that's distributed by NPR called Bullseye that I've been doing since I was 19, every week for coming up on 20 years.
Wow.
And besides that, I own a menswear blog called Put This On, and a little shop associated with the menswear blog.
Excellent. Also, dog enthusiast and bearded fellow, I would say.
All true. I'm 6'3", 210. Go about 210.
Yeah.
Somewhere in there. A little huskier than I used to be.
So I'm actually a big fan of Maximum Fun. You know how children, everything that's like in the future is tomorrow? My husband thinks everything that's a podcast is Max Fun.
Good for your husband.
Yeah, he's a real fan of mine. So I kind of wanted to start a little bit by talking about the Max Fun sort of philosophy. I feel like Max Fun is kind of known for having really inclusive and generally positive and uplifting shows. Can you speak a little to that?
Yeah, I think for us, there were basically, when I started doing this, there were sort of two lanes of entertainment. One was snarky or snide, or ironically composed, and one was lame. And I like a lot of, there's plenty of snark and snidery that I really love. But I had an experience early on in doing The Sound of Young America, which was the show that preceded Bullseye. It was when I was still in college in Santa Cruz, which is where the show started. And we had Dustin Diamond on the show, who listeners may know as Screech from Saved by the Bell. Or they may know him from his chess instructional videos, I was going to say. But yes, also porn.
No, yeah, that's what I was going to say. What did you
hear? Or
hear?
from getting cut by him with a knife in a bar. He went to jail for that one, I think.
Really?
Anyway, this was before the porn and before all the crazy stuff. It was just the chess instructional videos and being Screech on Saved by the Bell.
And you want to learn more about chess?
Being in a math rock band. I believe he was also in a math rock band. And anyway, we booked him on the show because he was coming to Santa Cruz, which was, unusual for a comedy performer to be on their way actually to town. We booked a lot of guests who were coming to the San Francisco Bay Area, sort of pretending that people would drive from Santa Cruz to San Francisco to go see something. And we are the right age to have watched Saved by the Bell as kids, and we just thought it would be interesting to talk to somebody who was on a show like that, Turns out he's a monster. He's just a terrible person who just told a bunch of street jokes about disabled people.
Cool.
And then the thing I remember most vividly is him telling a very distasteful joke that was not really funny. And us going like, well, maybe we can talk a little bit about your act. And he goes like, that is my act. And we're like, oh my God. And we were on live at the time. So we had a half-hour block with this guy, and there was nothing. We did not have the skills to fill the rest of the time. So we couldn't dump him, in other words. Like, we had to fill the hour to get to the Pacifica News, the KPFA News. So around then I thought, like, well, if I've got this thing, even as marginal as a community radio show is, I've got this thing. I should probably be using it for things that I like rather than things that I don't like or want to sort of make fun of. And I think Max Fun has grown out of that. It is very important to us that we be making, we don't want to make, Hallmark Channel specials. That is not our interest. We want to make real comedy that comes out of our, alternative comedy roots, like we love we love Mr. Show and, all those things that I remember, for me in college, it was Mr. Show, Tenacious D, and the Larry Sanders Show. Like those things were things that I didn't see till I was 19. I was like, this is the best thing ever, whatever. But, it might be The Simpsons or whatever it is. We want to make sharp stuff, but I think that we had gotten to a kind of cultural point where demonstrating that you were not mainstream by being snide or being snarky was just lame. It was not funny to me anyway. And it wasn't of much interest to me. And besides that, I think we have also, especially over time, worked hard to make stuff that, in our being funny, isn't going to be excluding and hurting people. And I don't think that we're doing that in a perfect way by any means. And, that's just like, that's not the top thing that we're trying to do in the world. I think the top thing that we're trying to do in the world is make great shows. But it is of consequence to us that we not, like, basically the reason is I don't want to be an asshole and I don't want to work with assholes.
I feel like that's a good life philosophy to have.
So like I know comedy people who are very funny who are assholes, and I don't have a lot of time for it.
Yeah.
Like it's just not how I want my life to be. So that is the reason that we, that is like the top way in which we have tried to be values driven. And when we add shows to the network or create shows, we are always actively looking for how does this show add to people's lives and make the world better in some way. Yeah. And again, like not in like for every show we buy a cow for a farmer in the third world or, whatever like that. But just like we want to be additive to the good of the world rather than negative to the good of the world.
Yeah, and I feel like, so my show is targeted towards atheists in general. And a feedback we get a lot, and I feel like it's probably similar to you, is that it's people from smaller towns or people who don't understand them, and they're kind of othered in some way. In my case, in case of my listeners, they're the only atheist in a Baptist town or something like that. And I feel like Max Fun has had a really net positive impact on just people who are not cis straight white guys, and I think that's something to be, to be proud of and to celebrate. So, what do you say when I feel like we hear a lot from the old whites that PC police has ruined comedy? And I don't find that. Like, I'm re-listening to old episodes of My Brother and Me, and the first 100 episodes were a little rough, and they've gotten better. And gotten more inclusive, gotten more mindful of their language. It's not less funny. So why do you think people think that? And what would you say to that?
I think that being a comic, and especially a stand-up comic, is a really, really, really hard job. And you only have one feedback loop, and that is the audience laughing. And so I think a lot of comics, especially stand-up comics, see a kind of absolute value in does this thing generate laughter? And older people in general, one of the things that happens as we get older is, you get into patterns of behavior that are harder and harder to flex when you're older. So I think that for a lot of comics, and I'm talking particularly about stand-ups, they have this experience which is, well, if I do it and they laugh, that's good. I have succeeded at my goal. And I think that the harshest reactions to so-called PC culture or whatever, in comedy specifically, come from people who feel betrayed, comics who feel betrayed by that feedback loop, right? They're like, before I could, whatever, say something was retarded, and I could get a laugh. And even if the laugh was not at the expense of intellectually disabled people specifically, but that could be part of, putting some juice in a punchline and it would work. And now if I, go do a college show, people walk out, right? And so I can see from their perspective how that feels, because it feels like a betrayal of the deal that they made when they became a comic, which was, I can say this thing, that gets a laugh, that's an absolute good. But I also think that skips the kind of the first part, which is, your job in comedy, and especially in stand-up, is to make people laugh. And so you don't really get to not be responsible for the audience's reaction to your material. And so if you are doing stuff that is alienating to the audience for whatever reason, you're talking about sexual assault, and if you're in a club with 100 people in it, there's, probably 20 who have been sexually assaulted. So, they might not think that's funny, and if you are doing that and you're aware of that consequence, that you're alienating people in your audience, as far as I'm concerned, you better have a reason that you're doing it besides, I think this is funny. You know what I mean?
I can't think of a better joke.
Yeah, I think there has to be. Yeah, I think there has to be a moral basis for it, and there typically in those situations there really isn't. I think that the comics who talk about this stuff, and I think it's a relatively small proportion of the stand-up community that get amplified by the media because they're older or whatever. But I think the comics who talk about this kind of stuff, they don't want to be responsible for what they're saying. And to me, that is one of the top jobs of the comic. And so what they do is they conflate the kind of morally responsible alienating speech that might find its way into a comedy routine. A stand-up act is not just about how many funny things can you put in it. I mean, it could be, but it's not always that. There's plenty of room for speaking truth to power and all of those things. They conflate that with the being a jerk to people. And I think that because comics always see themselves as powerless outsiders, even if they're Chris Rock or Jerry Seinfeld, because that is what led them, feeling like a powerless outsider is what led them into comedy. It's not a career that you would choose, if you it's too much. It's too much focused hard work of a very particular kind that has to do with controlling others and their feelings.
Yeah.
Then someone who was, the captain of the football team or whatever, in high school would have done. So it is also very difficult for those people, whether it's, whoever. I mean, brilliant, Chris Rock or Jerry Seinfeld have, occasionally sort of said something like this. And that's two of the greatest stand-up comics of all time and total brilliant geniuses. And I think by all evidence that I've seen, probably pretty decent guys as well. It is hard to understand the way that the impact of what you're doing changes over the course of your life. And it's hard for people who are in privileged positions to see their own privilege. And it's only recently that I could say the word privilege and assume the audience knew what I was talking about even, I mean, I was an American Studies major in college. My mom my mom taught that stuff when I was a kid in a college. So that was just part of my childhood. My mom is a white person with a master's degree in Latin American Studies. You can't get through that without knowing all your Deleuze and all your whatever. But I think it's hard even just to see that. And so, long story short, I think a lot of us, like me and Jordan on Jordan Jesse Go, or or the McElroys for that matter, have the skill that we have tried to develop is listening to our audience and hearing the ways that what we are doing is affecting them and their lives. And it doesn't mean that we have to like take all the edges off or anything like that. We just think about the consequences.
Yeah.
And we make mistakes, and I think we're lucky to work in a medium where we have a reasonable presumption of goodwill from our audience and from our audience to us. That means that, you know, when we do something that makes someone feel uncomfortable, our audience tends to feel comfortable telling us that in a way that is not, that is typically not accusatory and not defensive, but generous. You know, like I would like to help you, you know, help your audience.
Right, right. So I know as a journalist, you do not have opinions about politics.
Yeah. Did you know Jim Lehrer is for a longtime anchor of the new PBS NewsHour? He doesn't vote.
Shut up.
Yeah, voting is secret, and he doesn't vote because he takes his responsibility as an impartial journalist that seriously. I mean, he's now retired from the NewsHour, so maybe he's gone back to voting, but...
You vote, right?
I do vote. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's wild.
I vote straight natural law. No, that's not true. Sorry if anyone from the National Law Party is listening.
There's 14 people listening to this, so I wouldn't...
Please don't email NPR and say that I said that.
But after 2016, I feel like there were... I don't know if a tonal shift is the right word, but something seemed to change with a lot of comedy podcasts and just in Max Fun in general. Did you notice that, or was that just a shift that naturally occurred, that progress that we felt like had been we'd been making no longer felt real anymore?
I think that rhetorically speaking, in comedy, people felt a lower overall ambient sense of safety. And I think that, you know, circa 2015, especially if you're, you know, a straight, cis, white male like myself, you know, there weren't a lot of, the ground felt very solid under your feet. And I think that a lot of people who felt like the world was very solid, like we all were on the same page, like, you know, why this is just a joke. Right. Which, you know, is like part of the social contract of making any joke, is like you have to have this kind of security that they're not taking you down. And like that felt relatively safe. And I think that the way the media has changed and the way that the general tone of the country has changed over the past, 4 years, maybe, has led people to be less likely to feel that baseline security. And that includes talent and audience and whatever. And so some people's reaction to that has been to many people's reaction to that has been to very explicitly, like, pick a team. So you can say, like, we have a circle of safety, like a mutual understanding, a social trust within this specific context, and then anybody who's outside of that context, we just don't have to worry about because they are whatever, infidels or you know what I mean. And some people have, I think, their thinking has developed and their understanding has developed about what it is like to stand on shaky ground socially, and in terms of the culture and kind of cultural capital and power, and hegemony, if you will. And for that reason, they are more aware of being careful of others. I also think that another thing that has happened is that for all the ways that social media in the last 5 to 10 years has changed rhetoric in the country for the worse, and I think that they are many. I think that one positive effect is that people, and especially performers, are more aware of the breadth of people that they are addressing when they speak. And because, I'm sure you've seen those like sociological studies about how few friends who are people of color white people have and that kind of stuff. Like one of the things about being privileged is that you have to make an active choice to recognize and understand your privilege in a way that people who are not socially privileged don't, because, like if you're a black person and you work for a company, you're probably in a room of 12 people, you're probably one of one or two, you know? So you're constantly having to pay attention to that. Whereas if you're one of the white people, it's never even occurred to you it might be different for the black person often.
Right.
So I think that one of the positive things about social media is that because power is in some ways relatively flat, and because social conventions are different, people feel comfortable calling out, whether that calling out is the, maybe ruder and potentially less productive kind, or the kind that we're very grateful to often get at Max Fun, which is a more helpful to us kind, like hey, this is how I felt about that,
right?
Just so you know,
and you can choose what to do with that in the future. Yeah. So actually, the podcast that helped me find Max Fun is Ono, Ross, and Carrie. I think it's a really interesting contribution to the sort of slate of shows you have. What brought Ono, Ross, and Carrie is Ross Blotcher, Carrie Poppy, and their slogan is "We show up so you don't have to." So whether that's joining Scientology or whether that's trying a new detox thing that probably makes them poop too much, that's what they do. What was appealing for that to bring into your audience?
Well, we knew Carrie particularly through our community in general. In the early days of Ono, Ross, and Carrie, Carrie was a very active member of the Max Fun community and was friends with some folks who worked here through the Max Fun community and that kind of thing. She played on the Max Fun softball team. I think that might have been before Ono, Ross, and Carrie joined.
There's a Max Fun softball team?
There was. We went 0-10, and it was very difficult. Not a lot of jocks working at Max Fun, as it turns out. Couldn't beat the animal hospital. But anyway.
I used to work at a marketing firm, and it was a bunch of nerd writers. And we had a softball team or a kickball. We had both a softball team and a kickball team. We were known as the team with the most dudes who wore skinny jeans to the game.
Yeah.
So I feel ya.
Yeah. So, I could do an hour on the Max Fun softball team, but I'm not going to.
What position did you play?
Well, unfortunately, we had a shortage of pitchers who could throw it underhand and make it to home plate and through the strike zone.
Wow. That's pretty essential to most softball teams.
So we had one ringer. We had a woman who we didn't know before the team started who had played college softball. So she played shortstop. And I usually played third base, but I was the backup pitcher. If Brian Fernandez, the producer of Jordan Jesse Go, was not there that week, I was the other guy who could get it through the strike zone.
I don't want to brag, but I do pitch for a 14-inch softball team in the Chicago suburbs. We also went 0-10 this past season, so...
but that's an appropriate punishment for playing a weird regional variation of softball.
That's right. 16 inches regional.
Yeah.
What did you guys play out here?
Regular softball.
With a mitt?
Yeah.
That feels like a lot to ask for
somebody. The other thing is a weird made-up thing that only happens in the frozen north.
Okay, first of all, we have a lot of time to kill in the winter.
Don't you have a weird kind of bowling also? I feel like there's another weird
Boston.
kind of bowling.
They have candlepin
and
bowling.
Then there's something where people play hockey with brooms.
That seems
another
like
thing.
something my gym teacher made up.
Anyway, we're off topic. So with Ross and Carrie, I knew that Carrie was doing this show, and I knew Carrie worked at the Center for Inquiry, which is like a skeptics organization here in Los Angeles. I knew she was very involved in that community. But frankly, even as, and I can say this, despite even as an atheist myself, I was pretty, pardon the pun, skeptical about bringing a skeptic program into Max Fun because I have not in my time on Earth found that the skeptic community as a whole publicly displays the values that I would like Max Fun to reflect.
I would say that's true, and you can see my Twitter for proof.
Yeah. So basically, like, I think it's a bunch of the worst things about nerds, which is like saying, well, actually, and not considering other people's social conventions and what values they might provide to them and that kind of thing.
These are all true.
And being contemptuous of people's most deeply held beliefs. And like, I'm an atheist, but like, I went to church as a kid. I worked at a church for a while. I had a very nice time working at the church. Was very glad to work there. I think I'm not opposed to religion in the slightest on the whole. I just don't buy it. But hold on, this is my. It's fucking Kaiser. Sorry. Can you mark that, Danny? So I listened to Ross and Carrie's show, and the thing that I liked about Ross and Carrie's show is that they, they come from a religious background of which they are not contemptuous. You know, they made their own choices about how they wanted to live their life, but they're not a jerk about it. And they are so sincere and open-hearted in their work that it always really that it really impressed me. I also thought they were fun and funny, and they were doing crazy shit, which I thought was great. Even then, they were already doing crazy stuff. But like, the thing that I liked about it was I was like, oh, this is. Goodness knows there are plenty of people who are not only, secular humanists or something in the Max Fun audience, but people for whom being a secular humanist or an atheist is part of their like actual identity, not a kind of incidental thing in their life. And I knew that those people probably wanted some kind of media that was about that stuff that they were interested in, because, I think often because religion was a really huge part of their life at some point, that then, they had to make big moves to change that, or, they're the only atheist in town or whatever. And so that's what I loved about Ross and Carrie, is that they gave the same like sincere consideration to every subject they covered and every person that they brought on their show, and they weren't afraid to say that it was silly, but even if something was truly silly, they were able to talk about that in a way that was respectful to people who believed in it. Because, there is a fundamental conflict between the activist atheist community, the jerky ones, and the faith community, which is, the fundamental premise of faith is that faith makes your life better, and it's not based on anything, and that's why it makes your life better. And so, like, I think that that is something that there's no path forward if you're not respectful of that for other people. So, that was what I loved about Ross and Carrie, is that they always bring sincere regard and respect. Yeah, they both. I'm friends with Ross, but they're both so nice, like aggressively nice, like bordering on insincere. But I think it's sincere. No, it's totally sincere as far as I can tell. Ross works at Disney. You know? Like, he
invited me into his office tomorrow. I'm very excited.
It's fun. You should go. Yeah,
I'm super stoked. Okay, so I listened to Jordan Jesse Go. And I feel like I remember hearing something, but it's really hard to go through the back catalog to find anything.
Yeah, I mean, if the show had topics, that would help.
Yeah. Oh, can you give a little elevator pitch on Jordan Jesse
Jordan
Go?
Jesse Go is what we thought a podcast was going to be 12 years ago. It's two guys talking about nothing. We think we're very refined at it, but there's really no reason to listen. There's no convincing. There's nothing I could tell you about Jordan Jesse Go that would lead you to even try listening to Jordan Jesse Go.
It's really funny.
People who listen to it like it.
I listened to it this morning because I really needed to know what the 2019 flavor of the year was.
Yeah.
Anyway, did you say that you almost joined a cult or were invited to a cult when you lived in San Francisco? Or is that a thing I'm hallucinating?
I once got invited. I once went to a meeting of a semi-cult. Cult is strong.
Okay. You would call it
It's not exactly religious. And there's no like live-in elements as far as I know.
Is there a
but
head
I
shaving
went to
element?
something that I think Ross and Carrie covered on their show called Landmark Forum. So there was a really, I'm just going to be frank. There was a very cute girl at my high school who had transferred to our school from a school in Virginia. And I went to an arts high school, and she was like a very serious student. And she was very disappointed at the level of scholarliness at our high school. She ended up having to take math classes at other high schools because she ran out of math classes to take at our high school. I think she eventually got a doctorate from MIT.
Okay. And she went to an arts high school because...
And she went to because she was also a talented musician.
Ah, okay.
She also wrestled on another school's wrestling team. She went to Lincoln High School, I believe, in San Francisco, to wrestle on their wrestling team.
This woman is my hero.
This woman was very clear-eyed, and her father was a career Navy guy or something like that. She was like goal-oriented to the extreme. Anyway, she was a cool lady, and she was very cute, and she invited me to her like graduation from the Landmark Forum, which is a sort of like combination of a cult, a self-improvement thing, and like an organizational system, like a life like it's like somewhere between life coaching and a cult. And it was weird. It was a weird experience. It was it had been very beneficial to her. And was nothing like, you know, as far as I know, I haven't read a ton about it. You know, I'm sure there's a Landmark Forum nerd in the audience who's like shaking their fist at me right now. But like, as far as I know, there's nothing like super evil about it or anything. It's just pretty intense, and it's like basically self-help multi-level marketing.
Oh.
And the thing that I remember about this meeting was there were a lot of these kind of testimonials and call and responses in this graduation ceremony that the only reference that I had for that, especially as a guy who, I mean, like, I went to church as a kid, but I went to a San Francisco Episcopalian church, so the service is pretty English and the values are hyper liberal. You know, like the service is pretty emotionally reserved. You know, there was not a lot of testifying in my church, in other words.
Sure.
So the main experience that I had that it reminded me of was going to AA meetings with my dad when I was a kid. So my dad was in recovery is still in recovery. And, but he was going to meetings very, very regularly when I was little. And, he had partial custody of me and no money for babysitters. So like I would just go and color in the corner, right? And there's this kind of format of, you know, someone says hello and everyone says hello back to them, and you repeat everybody's name and all these things that make it feel like a secure, safe, powerful space that are part of what makes AA work, I think. That maybe in Landmark Forum, these things were being used to get you to sign up for the next Landmark Forum class. I don't know. But yeah, that was the closest I've ever come to joining a cult. And I remember saying that to this girl and her mom who had driven us there in their minivan on the way home. Then they asked what I thought of it. I was like, you know, I don't know. I was not that into it. It sort of reminded me of... And they were like, okay, cool. Okay. They were nice about it. I was probably 15 or 16. Yeah.
Old enough to know cult when you saw it.
Yeah. I mean, again, like, I don't think it's a particularly insidious cult. If it's helped you, then it's helped you. But
on the scale of good to bad cults, it's okay. Also, this is the portion of the program where I ask you to relay charming anecdotes to my audience. So, you mentioned Maya Angelou and a psychic on the show I just listened to today, and I really liked it, and I was wondering if you could talk about it more.
I used to work on a radio show called West Coast Live, and my boss was a woman named Kathy Kamen Goldmark, and she's passed away now, but she was a totally amazing woman. She was a novelist and had worked in every part of the book industry, and produced this radio show, which was substantially about books, and just an amazing, vivacious, like, brilliant woman, and a real jack of all trades. And one of her, if she had one thing that was her claim to fame, it was that she founded a band. She had also been a professional musician. Mm-hmm. She founded a band called the Rock Bottom Remainders, which was composed of her. There was a sort of semi-rotating lineup, but it was like her, Dave Barry, Amy Tan. They were like the core. They were like the core members, and Matt Groening, and Stephen King.
Sure, Stephen King's a musician.
And some of these people just sang backup or played harmonica or whatever. And I think Amy Tan was famous for coming on in S&M gear, doing "These Boots Are Made for Walking" and then leaving. I met Amy Tan a couple times. She's a super cool lady. But anyway, she was in this band, and one of the members of this band was Maya Angelou, who's actually a very accomplished singer. And so she was actually very good friends she was very close with Maya Angelou. They were like real buddies. And one day, Maya Angelou's son, who's a very talented poet, was on the show, and he was a kind of a regular on the show. And Kathy was like, "Did I ever tell you this story about your mom?" And he's like, "What's that?" And she's like, "Jesse, you should hear this." It's like, one time Maya called me up, and she had like $700 in billings from the Miss Cleo psychic hotline. And Kathy was like, "I told her, Maya, you are a very smart woman. Like, you have to know that this is a hustle. Like, these are not real psychics." And Maya Angelou said, "But they are real psychics," in a Maya Angelou voice. And Kathy was like, "Come on, how do you know that they're real psychics? Like, this can't possibly be true." And she's like, well, I talked to one, and she knew my name, and I'd never mentioned it. That's one name out of 300 million in the United States, And Kathy said, "Yeah, so you had been talking to her on the line for a while?" And Maya Angelou was like, "Yes." And Kathy just said, "Maya, you know how you just gave the convocation at the inauguration of President Clinton? And 200 million people watched that?" And she's like, "Yes." And she goes like, "Maya, I don't mean to put too fine a point on it, but do you think it's possible you have a distinctive voice?" Yeah.
Oh, that's excellent. Thank you very much. I want to ask you a little bit about kind of social media. And would you mind talking a little bit about your daughter? Not specifically.
Yeah, sure.
So you have a daughter. How old is she?
She's 7.
7. And she is trans, and we had this.
I have 3 kids,
Mm-hmm.
almost 2-year-old, 5-year-old, and a 7-year-old. And a couple years ago, when she was pretty fresh in kindergarten, the oldest told us that she was a girl. We had presumed her to be a boy. And she told us her name, which initially she said Grease.
Oh.
Which we figured out she meant Grace, which we were very grateful for, because we didn't want to tell her she couldn't have the name she wanted, but we also didn't want to have a child named Grease.
Do you think it would have been like the country or like the food substance?
I couldn't tell you. I could not tell you. I always thought of the musical. So she sort of told us that she was a girl, and when she told us that, it also kind of made clear a lot of other things that had been going on with her previously that we maybe could or should have understood to be her trying to express that to us. But, basically, the very, very short version of it is one day, in the bathtub or whatever, my wife pointed out to Grace that not all girls have vaginas. Some girls have penises. And not all boys have penises. Some boys have vaginas or other stuff. And not in any more specific terms than that, but when she said that, Grace was very clear. Oh, yes, that's what I am. And it was like, all these things from before, like she was totally obsessed with this scene in the Jungle Book where Baloo dances in a grass skirt.
Oh.
And we always just, I don't know, it had not even occurred to, like, we thought, like the prospect of her being a femi boy had occurred to us, but she also, her interests were not particularly culturally coded as femi, like building stuff and stuff. So she said it to us, and so she's been living as a girl since then, which is the last few years.
And what I think is interesting is I see you on Twitter and social media a lot, and you are willing to engage with sort of transphobic people fairly frequently.
Sometimes. For a 2-week period recently, I decided to, yeah.
And can you kind of speak a little to that? Because I get into those phases too sometimes where I'm like, I'm going to argue with strangers on the WGN Facebook group because it feels cathartic to me right now. Is it catharsis, or is it an urge to educate, or is it just...
Wait, are you arguing about the Cubs game? Like WGN, the television network?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's WGN Chicago News. So, like, somebody will be mad that the river was dyed green, and I'm just going to
I thought you were mad about their new efforts at creating prestige programming. Okay, so, so basically, when we didn't really... My wife is also hosts a podcast called One Bad Mother, and there wasn't really a way for us to move forward in our lives without being at least somewhat public about Grace being a girl. Because it would just be, like, we just have, neither of our shows are exactly about our kids, but, and especially not mine. Teresa's is kind of about parenting in general, but... we just couldn't stop telling anecdotes about our son Simon and start telling anecdotes about our daughter Grace. So I did an episode of the show where I explained it, and we had a friend of the show on, a regular guest who is a trans woman, to talk a little bit about her experience, because on Jordan Jesse Go, she had this. She sometimes works here at Max Fun as a writer, and she, many years ago, had called in to Jordan Jesse Go the first time she went out in women's clothes when she didn't even think of herself as trans. And then she became a comic after that, moved to Los Angeles to be a comic. She lived in, I think, Akron. And she moved to Los Angeles to be a comic. We ended up having her on Jordan Jesse Go just as a comic, as a local comic that we knew. And she was like, "Did you know that I was that person who called in that one time?" We were like, "No, we did not know
Oh my
that."
God.
So she had this kind of funny version of a coming out story on Jordan Jesse Go. So we had her there, and it was great. And I literally got one email from someone who was weird about it. And that person was more weird about it than they were jerky about it. And, I just wrote them back and said, "You're wrong. Go suck a lemon." And,
Go
because,
kick rocks.
well, like the two crazy things about these people who correct you when you're the parent of a trans child are, like, one, the people who think you are, like, making your child do this. You're like, have you ever tried making your child do anything? Like, I can hardly get my child to watch Sesame Street instead of Inspector Gadget, and, like, my children don't know the password to the computer that they watch it on. Like, it's very hard to get kids to do things. And the other thing is that you have, this comes from some kind of, like, ideological, like, no, no one wants this. Like, I love my child to the end of the world and back, and I'm so happy that she came out because it will make her life better and safer. But like, if I had the choice between a child whose life is difficult and complicated and requires facing prejudice and danger every day of her entire life for the rest of her life and not, I would have chosen not.
Sure.
Like, I'm doing this because people will send you, suicide rates for transgender people, and I'm like, yeah, you
it's
think
'cause of
I
you.
did, yeah, like, but also like, you think I didn't think about that when I figured out she was transgender? Like, the parents who are in this position, like, we've got a lot of skin in the game here. We've done a lot of reading.
This wasn't a light thing to happen.
No, God, no. So anyway, months later, a comedian named Owen Benjamin was complaining. A former comedian/comedian named Owen Benjamin was complaining about PC culture in comedy, and he was doing it in response to a tweet that my co-host and friend John Hodgman had written about an experience that John had with an older comedian who had tried to kind of sell him that line about, this is free speech and PC culture is killing comedy. And John's position on it basically was like, like, old people are old people, and I don't believe this person is malicious. And this was one of the great, he didn't use his name. This is one of the great comedy people that I love. And, it's okay for old people to be old people, when they're not being hateful about it, but he's wrong, and it's okay for us to be young people who get it. And Owen, I'm on a first name basis with this man I've never met. Owen retweeted him and said some shitty thing about it, and then somebody in the reply said, "Well, what do you expect? His boss is giving his kid hormone replacement therapy or some shit like that." And then I was like, somebody called, maybe they tagged me, some shit, I don't remember. And anyway, I went through this period of dealing with this comedian who I think is actually maybe somewhat unhinged, and his fan base, many of whom are definitely unhinged, that lasted a few weeks, and then it kind of faded. And there was like some shitty things that happened from it, like this guy was being a real asshole, and he was repeatedly making jokes about there's a guy named David Hogg, the teenage mass shooting survivor,
yeah.
Making jokes about his pubes, and he'd done all these horrible. They got him kicked off of Twitter. He'd done all these lousy things. He's a real not a. This guy's, I don't know. I don't know if he's a fundamentally bad person or if he. I know many people who knew him years ago. And thought he was a very nice man and are baffled by his turn. So that's what leads me to think that there's something unhinged. But anyway, a couple of weeks ago, it kind of, maybe a couple months ago now, it kind of recurred. And I had kind of engaged people. I mean, it's like, it's very hard not to, you want to defend your kid. Like, you feel like these people are attacking my kid. And you want to defend them. And I also think that, like, given our circumstances, that being what they call stealth, which is like a person who lives as a gender other than the one they were assigned at birth, but is not public about the fact that that's their situation, was never really an option for our daughter. We do feel a little bit of obligation to, like, kind of be out there. Like, we're not really activists, but we just want people to know that we have a transgender kid. It's fine. It's part of being human. And this, in the hopes that if this ever came up in their life, it would feel familiar to them, basically. Because we know that when we went through this situation, I think knowing some transgender people in our lives, including a close friend of Teresa's who had transitioned who had started his transition maybe a year or two before this all went down, like, it was there in our minds so that we could recognize it when Grace brought it up. Like, we knew enough to casually throw in that not all boys have penises or whatever. And so more recently, this cycle spun up again, and he made a new video about me, and he's
Really?
yeah. And so all these nut bars were tweeting horrible things at me, and on a vast spectrum of horrible. I mean, the thing about gender is, there's a lot of people who don't know much about it. And most of these people who are tweeting lousy things at me were not doing it to be hurtful. They were doing it because they don't know about gender and how it works in a situation like ours. And they maybe are sincerely worried that it's child abuse and so for a couple of weeks, maybe 10 days, I was like, when somebody tweets some shitty thing at me, I'm going to retweet it, quote tweet it, and say the way it actually works. Because even as somebody who knew transgender people in his day-to-day life, and I don't know, my neighbor when I was a kid was transgender. I grew up in the Mission in San Francisco. Like, I grew up 8 blocks from Castro Street. Like, this is always been part of. I went to UC Santa Cruz. Like, it's always been peripheral to my life, even in the 80s. But like, even for us, there were plenty of things that we didn't really know about how it worked that made us worried and uncomfortable. Not opposed to it, but like worried and uncomfortable because we didn't know. And I thought, like, I don't know if I'm going to convince any people that are tweeting at me. Like, it wasn't my goal to win against them. It was more like when they tweet me, like, how are you? Why is your child on, hormones? And they would say he is 5 years old or whatever. I'd be like, well, she's 7 and she's not on hormones. That's it. If she goes on hormones, it won't be for another 5 years or so. Or actually another 10 years or so. And if, maybe in 5 years or so, she'll go on hormone blockers, which forestall puberty. Right. And that's because you want the kid to be as old as possible when they make any decisions that have permanent consequences. Things like that, right? And my goal in doing that was, to have an action I could take. Because one of the really hard things about it is that you only have so much energy, but it's like, you're a horse fighting against 1,000 ducks or whatever the thing is, right? Like, I don't remember what that thing that they ask you on Reddit is, but like, there's even if there's 20 of these people, no amount of batting away will lead to you winning, but not doing anything really eats you up.
Yeah.
Like, blocking feels good and helps, and muting feels good. And I was actually muting everybody that I was retweeting. But like, I just didn't want to. I just didn't want to not do anything because it would have made me feel really bad. Because what you really want to do, I mean, in any situation where you're feeling bad, one of the things that you want to do is take an action, right? It's like going for a walk,
right?
You know what I mean? Like, the emotional energy becomes physical energy that needs an outlet. You need to do a thing. And so this was a thing where I thought, like, this is probably not going to convince very many people that are whatever who came to Owen Benjamin because they want this. But I was like, I've got 50,000 people who follow me on Twitter, and based on my experience, probably almost all of those people generally have a positive opinion about gender nonconforming people. They're not like hateful bigots, but probably most of them are sincerely curious about what it means and what the resources are. And I had a pediatrician talk to me at Max FunCon, which is an annual kind of conference we give, named Dave. And Dave, Dr. Dave, was like, when you talked about that on Jordan Jesse Go, I've been a pediatrician for 25 years, but I thought I should incorporate gender into my practice because I work with a lot of kids and teenagers. And so once the kids are old enough that I have time with them without their parents present, I check in with them about their gender identity and their health.
Wow.
And I thought, like, well, if there's 50,000 people on this Twitter feed, there's probably 50 who are going to come in like pretty direct contact with this stuff. Like a kid of theirs or a niece or nephew of theirs or their uncle or their brother or sister or whatever. And I was like, I can't like teach these people everything they need to know, but what I can do is, because it's a lot of stuff and it's hard and scary, but what I can do is just get enough information into their heads that they can see the broad outlines so that if they have to fill it in later, they can. You know, like, because that was, as I said, that was the thing for me. Like, it was like understanding, it was like, I had a generally positive feeling about gender nonconforming people. I had like no opposition to it. I was all for it. Let's go, change the IDs, all that kind of thing or whatever. But like for me, it was, when it was in my family, it was just barely within my grasp to recognize it when I saw it. And so I wanted to get people there. Like I feel like I can probably get some people there so that when a kid in their Boy Scout troop or their sister or whatever is going through something, they've got enough skills to say, like, this looks like something I can be helpful or learn more. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I'm curious. So both your podcast and your wife's, One Bad Mother, you talk a lot. I mean, hers is a little more directly related, but you talk a lot about your personal life on Jordan Jesse Go. And you've been doing Jordan Jesse Go for
12 years.
12
I
years?
think at this point, yeah.
I mean, it seems to me that the Probably Show wouldn't really exist the way it did if you and Jordan weren't very forthright with like what's going on in your life. But do you ever have a moment of, do you wish you'd left your kids kind of out of it, or do you? If I had left
my kids out of it, I would have nothing to talk about because all I do is work and take care of my kids. I think both Jordan and I on our show have carved out a portion of our lives that we talk about on the show. And there have been times when we have opened up our deepest feelings banks. You know, like literally to the point where I could list them. You know, when my dog died many years ago, after Ferguson, I talked about a story from my teenage years that I couldn't get out of my head. A few times like that. Generally, I think we are like stand-up comics in that the parts of our lives that we reveal on the air are the parts that make for show content. Like the premise of our show is not that you get to know our emotional lives. It's like being friends or friendly acquaintances with us. So we are really careful about never revealing anything about our families or even our own lives that is really intended for an intimate audience. You know, my daughter is a girl at the Five and Dime. Who goes when she's getting a phosphate at the Five and Dime? She's a girl, right? Like she's a girl everywhere in the world. It's just a fact of her life that is what it is.
Yeah,
you know. And but like there are also things that we don't talk about. I mean, like if you've been a longtime Jordan Jesse Go listener, you might notice that Jordan has never told a story. I mean, at least in 10 years, 11 years, has not told a story about like a bad date he went on. It's because he doesn't
keep dating.
Doesn't want to reveal that part of his life, right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of that. So I think that it's a funny thing that like when you listen to a podcast, it feels like because of the authenticity inherent in the form and the and the medium, it feels like you know somebody very intimately. And we are real and authentic. We're not faking anything, but we're also, there are broad swaths that we decide not to involve.
Is that an active decision? Or is it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an active decision.
instinctual?
I mean, at this point, I've been doing it long enough, deciding what is and isn't something I want to talk about in public, that that it feels natural. It's rare that I have to make an active decision. That would typically be in a situation where the stakes are high, like talking about Grace coming out. But when we talked about Grace coming out, as I said, we thought about it and it was like, there's not really a way to not talk about it.
Right.
And also it's fucking fine. It's how people live their lives.
Right.
So it feels natural.
Yeah, absolutely. So
also, like most of my deepest feelings are not very interesting. Much less funny. You know what I mean? Like, I was really sad when my grandma died, but there wasn't anything funny.
And you didn't think
about
that would be good comedy fodder?
No.
Before we go, is there anything you want to say about Roberto Clemente? I know he's a person you like to talk about, and my husband lectured me a while about him.
About what a great American Roberto Clemente was?
What I said was, I think a podcast I listened to said anyone who doesn't like Roberto Clemente is racist. Does that mean anything to you? He's like, yes, and let me tell you why. I don't know. I just didn't know if you wanted to share with a new audience your love for Roberto Clemente.
I have really strong feelings about racism and baseball independently, together as well. I think the person that I said, if you don't like him, you're probably racist, was Ricky Henderson. Ricky Henderson is a Hall of Famer, one of the greatest baseball players of all time, who played for the A's when I was a kid, which was my dad's favorite team. So we'd go to the Coliseum, we'd see him and stuff. And an amazing showy player who was famous for making what they call a snap catch, which is if he had an easy fly ball, he'd catch it by flicking his glove at it rather than putting his glove up at, which is sort of like non-traditional and showy. And he wore electric green batting gloves, and he was a thrilling, very exciting player. And he also now and has always talked in the third person primarily. And was famous for doing a few things like the first time he got $1 million paycheck, he framed it instead of cashing it. To the point where at the end of the season, the team called him and was like, it seems like you didn't cash $1 million check. Our books aren't balancing. And he's like, yeah, I framed it instead. I don't need the $1 million right now. But anyway, like he's like he's an incredible, charming, delightful man. But I think he was portrayed as a simpleton or as lazy because of racism. And so I got invited on a 30 for 30 podcast for ESPN where I talked this guy's ear off about how passionately I feel about this. I ended up getting cut from the show. But yeah, like I definitely, baseball is the thing that I loved when I was, 9 to 16 in the way that some people might love Star Wars or whatever. But more. I mean, I read probably 300 or 400 books about baseball. I mean, I had a whole bookshelf of baseball books, all of which I had read. And I also care very much about social justice. So they're a natural fit. There's a very beautiful graphic novel of the life of Roberto Clemente, though.
Oh, is there?
Speaking of Roberto Clemente. Yeah, I think it's called, I think 25 was his number. I think it's called 25 maybe, but
I'm going to have to get that for my husband. He does not listen to my podcast. So
very gorgeous.
It will be good. Well, thank you so much for your time. I feel like I've overstayed my welcome for sure. I appreciate you letting me drop in your office and recording. Do you have anything you would like to promote? We've done a really good job of selling Jordan Jesse Go, I think. Yeah, I mean, Jordan Jesse Go is the dumb comedy show where we swear a lot and we're pretty gross. Vulgar, not gross. Vulgar. Sometimes gross. But we're not like gross.
Like my
No.
friend Aaron hosts a podcast called Throwing Shade. One of the first episodes I listened to was about her losing a tampon inside herself.
Okay.
And that was gross. That was a lot. That was a lot. The consequences, not the going into the consequences was intense. But anyway, Jordan Issigo's a dumb comedy show. I feel like the natural fits are Bullseye, which is the show on which I interview figures from the world of arts and culture thoughtfully and in depth, especially funny and fun ones. And then Judge John Hodgman, where John Hodgman, who folks know from The Daily Show or from the Mac versus PC commercials or whatever, is a judge and I am the bailiff, and real people with real disputes come on. And it is very funny, but also John is actually a very sincerely wise person.
Yeah.
And, he gives very deep, heartfelt
He's the best.
decisions. Yeah, people adore him. People like me much more on that show. I think it's just because I'm standing next to John.
I actually saw Judge John Hodgman live in Chicago, and my brother and I did it. It was like when you just call in the audience, and you did not find my favorite, which is fine. But also, my brother said something, and it made you laugh and spin around, and he still talks about it.
What was your case?
So you might remember this. I started with saying my brother and I are very close, and then you made fun of me for like a minute, which is fair. But we are. And he had not told me that he and his girlfriend were moving in together. And I asked him why, and he said, well, you didn't ask. And I said, please tell him that he is required to tell me important things in his life. And John asked how I found out. And I said from my mom, and Kevin yelled, our mom. And that really tickled you. And so he's been dining out on that for about a year now.
Well earned.
Yes.
Well earned.
So, yeah, Kevin, we get it. Jesse likes you better than me. Anyway, thank you so much for your time
No problem.
and all that. And guys, we'll talk to you next week. Bye.